Hello, and welcome to episode 35 of the Following Mechanical Turks project. This episode, we're joined by Dr. Lauren Cagle of University of Kentucky. She's going to talk with us about, as we move into the sort of second product of our research project, we're turning more toward looking at how the hits themselves interact with the MTurk participants, both sort of, in a group sense, the Turkers, but then also authors, right? So the different sort of forms of participants on the platform. Nathaniel, I'm going to turn it over to you since you were forming the sort of prompt questions we had.
Yeah. Well, good morning, Cagle. Thanks for joining us. So I wanted just to kind of start with to sort of ask you to talk a little bit about your Stranger Shots project, because that was sort of, in addition to other sort of conversations you and I have had on social media about this project, but that was kind of the piece of yours really made the connection in terms of why we wanted to kind of talk to you, sort of how you sort of interact with that kind of both what the research project is about, but also which you sort of thought about attending to the methodology. Because what's interesting about the Stranger Shots is that Stranger Shots themselves can be a kind of methodology, right? The ways in which and I still remember, and correct me if I'm wrong or refresh my memory, you were on a panel that sort of talked about the kind of doing research in digital spaces where those digital themselves suspect. So like spending time on a alt-right website, right, gives it traffic, but you have to be on there to study, like those kinds of questions, right? So I guess the question that we sent you is like, what sort of drew you to that project of Stranger Shots, and then sort of what kinds of things informed it?
Yeah, you are remembering correctly. That was a panel at C's a couple of years ago. In order to not bury the lead, I'll tell you, I actually have a methodology piece coming out in CNC next year on Stranger Shots. So look for that. So the Stranger Shots project is about trying to, for me at least, it was trying, as so often research is, to scratch a personal itch. Like I had realized, and I write about this in the piece that I've got coming out in CNC. So it's in the special issue on rhetorics of data that Les Hutchinson-Campos and Maria Novotny are guest editing. And so I interweave like the story of that project all the way from when it first sort of started to coalesce in grad school through publication into this methodology piece. And the start of the story is, they're thinking back to how I used to use the internet. The idea of like taking pictures of strangers and sharing them online was not a part of my early kind of digital life. And the Stranger Shot, right, is this phenomenon that I noticed at some point that other people were engaging in. And I'm sure if I went back and like looked at my Facebook from early or like late aughts, I probably did this too without thinking about it, where people take pictures of strangers and then post them online for the purposes of shaming. And so as I noticed this sort of happening, and I was like, how is this so popular? Like, why are people so into this? And it's both like the folks that I knew personally. So at the time, Twitter was not, it was mostly Facebook in terms of social media. I mean, I remember when Instagram was first a thing, and I was like, I don't need to put filters on my pictures to make them look cool. Like, I'm not going to get on Instagram. It was still very much Facebook. And I saw friends doing this, right? Where they would share a picture and be like, oh my God, look at this person, how they're dressed. And then you see these sites like People of Walmart crop up that are exclusively dedicated to this purpose. Now they'll say that they're not for shaming necessarily, right? But that's the behavior that all of the users of this site are engaging in. So basically, yeah, I wanted to scratch that itch of like, why are people like this? And what I ended up sort of coming to, and with that Stranger Shots piece in Computers and Composition, argues is that it is a new phenomenon that is simply, or appears, sorry, let me rephrase that. It appears to be a new phenomenon, but it's really just a rearticulation or reassembling of actors to perpetuate a very old phenomenon, right? Which is the disciplining of non-normative bodies in public space. And so, you know, if I remember reading like feminist critiques of Foucault in grad school, where they talked about that that's the big thing that he's missing in this idea of discipline is thinking about it through identity lenses. And so with the kind of 90s feminist theory, a lot of that is gender identity and thinking about like, okay, why is it that women or people who are, you know, articulated as women feel this pressure to shave their legs and, you know, wear makeup, and it's a sort of self-disciplining that's associated with the gaze and the kind of like external disciplining that you get, the feedback that you get when you don't do those things, right? So this is just a sort of continuation of that. But then I think probably the thing that makes it most relevant to your project is my argument that the reason that it works this way and the reason that this is the way that this has transformed in the digital space is specifically because of the assemblage of actors that exist currently. So my favorite part actually in that article, I actually cut a whole chunk where I went back to photography magazines from the 60s. And I was looking at ads so I could get prices for things. Because what I wanted to do was actually price the cost of a photograph, like a single photograph in like 1960, so that you could make the comparison of like, you know, let's say there's a picture on people of Walmart, a stranger shot, and 10,000 people react to it in some way. What would be the cost in 1960 of printing 10,000 copies of a photo and mailing them to strangers, right? To react to. So I cut most of that for space, but there is still a little chunk where I do that thought exercise where I say, okay, you know, the stranger shot, if we think about sort of how it functions, right? I take a photograph, I put it into some sort of like accessible public space where other people can react to it and then possibly share it with other people. Like, what would that take if we didn't have our current network of cell phones with cameras that are connected to the internet, that are connected to these social media sites that make it really easy to upload? Like, if you put any sort of roadblock in there, I think this phenomenon would be slowed down immeasurably, right? Like if you had to take the photo and then come home and put it on your computer and then upload it, I don't think we would see this phenomenon so much, right?
And the institutionalized people and practices that are part of, yeah, definitely that network writ large.
Yeah. So one day I'll do something with that, poking around the 1960s magazines, because I spent a lot of time in the art library being like, no, older, I want older.
Yeah, that'd be an awesome archival project. Oh, sorry, Nathaniel.
No, well, it makes me think too, right? I mean, getting at then how does one address that, right? If it's this whole network, right? As opposed to just shaming the people who shame people, right? Just stop. Is I'm thinking about, right, the things that I forget when this happened, but the way that Nextdoor app tried to add friction into the process of reporting suspicious behavior. Turns out what was leading to, you know, not surprisingly, racially motivated reportings of suspicious behavior was how easy it was to report suspicious behavior. And so they did is they actually changed the assemblage to add steps in that, right? So maybe like one of the ways you could combat stranger shots is changing, like throttling upload speeds or something like that, right? Just make it. I want to shame the person, but I don't want to wait 5 seconds to shame them. I only want to wait 2 seconds to shame them.
And you know, the challenge there, of course, is that there are reasons that we do want people to be able to share images live of others. So, I mean, the most obvious example is I'm uncomfortable with the word citizen, you know, resident or non-law enforcement recording of law enforcement, often in real time, sometimes, you know, extremely graphically in real time. And that's really important to allow, right? So how do you like distinguish these different cases? So a blanket, like, we need to throttle upload capacity, or we need to limit people's capacity to, share photos in public spaces. Let's say, for example, like, let's say we, tied it to a GPS location and said, if you're not in a building, or if you're not in a privately owned building, then you have to wait. Or you have to like solve a math problem. I don't know. I think of, for example, actually the thing I think of with barriers is Gmail's beer goggles beta. Do you know about this? They had, Gmail has like all of the beta features that you can go in and turn on in settings to try things out. And I don't know if it's still there, but some years ago they had a beer goggles filter or a setting where if you toggled it on, between like 10 p.m. and 6 a.m. or something, you had to solve a math problem to be able to send an email. Right. The idea to prevent like, drunk emailing.
That does bear a bit upon, right? I mean, I'm thinking it's a form of the sort of, the CAPTCHA of, which one of these pictures has a street sign in it. I mean, weirdly, right? Kind of human intelligence task, right?
Yes. No, it totally is, right? Because I guess like if you were an enterprising programmer who really liked to, drunk email your exes at 2 a.m., you could write a script to solve those problems for you pretty easily. But the average person is not going to do that.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And it kind of, sorry, Nathaniel.
Oh, no, go for it, Jeremy.
But just, it does speak to a lot of the things kind of we're addressing, in terms of how long is it until, CAPTCHA is often training machine learning sets as work. How long until there's a sophisticated way to determine, are you shaming this are you posting this because it's shameful, right? Are we going to get to a point where it's like, well, are you posting that certainly right now it could identify something like a law enforcement person, I bet, identify something like a badge or a uniform and say, okay, well, this needs to go right through versus, the lighting in this suggests it's taken inside a Walmart or something, Yeah.
And I mean, obviously, like then as is so often the case with automation, edge cases are the issue, right? So you're filming law enforcement, but they're off duty or they're undercover or they're plainclothes. You're filming law enforcement, but they're inside a Walmart, right? So how do you sort of capture those edge cases? And honestly, I think I don't think it's come up in any of the material that I've read or watched that you all have been assembling for this project. I'm just going to use the word assemble like a million times today. But moderation as a human intelligence task, right? So it's sort of been floating in the air around some of your conversations and distinctions between different types of human intelligence task, distinguished by verb, not noun, right? So like the translate versus interpret distinction that you all have talked about, or transcribe versus, or not translate, transcribe versus, affective response. And moderation is very much understood to be in the kind of affective response summary interpretation column. And so this is what the big platforms claim all the time. Like, it's impossible to moderate. We couldn't possibly do it. It's so impossible. And it's like, okay, I'm willing to have that conversation about the difficulty of moderating edge cases. If someone has a swastika for a profile picture, I feel like you can just go ahead and make that call, right? Like, you don't have to, we don't have to beat around the bush.
Here,
Yeah. And so in some ways, when we think about moderation as a sort of human intelligence task in the wild, it draws attention to the political piece, right? So I'm thinking about the talk that you all had. I'm trying to remember who you talked to about the sort of cultural, not cultural techniques, but just culture.
Would have been.
Yes. This is a space where we see culture at work, because the claims that platforms like Twitter or Facebook are making about what is or isn't a human intelligence task, which is sort of the inverse, right? Anytime they make a claim about what is or isn't possible via automation, the like flip side of that is they're making through omission, they're making a claim about what's a human intelligence task. And those claims are politically motivated, right? Like those claims do not exist in some sort of abstract sense. And so in the same way that you're tracing like the articulation of the human via hits on MTurk, you could do the same project. Oh, I guess what I'm saying is like going back to Casey's thing about cultural techniques, right? This is MTurk is a result of cultural techniques, and we see the same thing at work in like these platforms claims around what's possible vis-a-vis moderation.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No,
Oh, sorry, go ahead.
well, in one of the books that we looked at earlier, and I think we'll come back, and I think it's probably in our notes somewhere, is Nardi and Ekbia's Heteronation.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know anything about that.
Well, and they use the term heteronation to kind of describe what we're getting at, right? That these processes that are, and they link in that they talk about mechanical Turks, they talk about like ATMs, and they talk about mods and video games. And when those mods then become part of the game later on, and then like content moderation on things like Wikipedia and video game chats. And they together as hetero-based. It's kind of it's basically mated, but it's a mix of actors. They're coming at it. They're both in like political economy is their area. And what's the way that they link all those things together, right? And they're all a sense of sort of moving labor around, right? So that the ATM doesn't necessarily replace the teller. It's a machine that turns the customer into the teller.
Right.
The ways in which that kind of, but yeah, so that sort of thinking about the maybe in this piece, but in the third piece that we have planning is then sort of linking up these hits, how they fit into this large suite of things that are on the face of it related, right? In that sense, a Turker has a lot in common with someone checking out and bagging their own groceries at the grocery store.
Yeah.
And in common with things like, we have this kind of list of things like Be My Eyes, the accessibility service where for visually impaired people can, hold up their phone and, on demand, someone will say, okay, well, that's the, if they're in the grocery store, that's this. And so there are this sort of range of things that dip into these, as you say, assemblages.
And just a side note before we move on, one thing I find fascinating is which of those suite of, sort of contexts or sub-assemblages people recognize as an offsetting of labor and which ones they don't, right? So I feel like the reason I thought of this is the trope about like, I'm not going to bag my own groceries at the grocery store. Why should I, pay to do my own work? Because it costs the same, right? Like there's no cost savings. Right. And it's this weird situation where you have both options. And it's not like a teller versus an ATM where there's a clear value in terms of, 24/7 accessibility or drive-through or whatever, right? Like there's no 24/7 drive-through pay for your own groceries. And so people have this sense of like, of that being, there's something there, there's like a rupture there where people see the logic, but they don't in other cases. And I think that's really interesting.
Yeah, that example is so awesome too, because it's like the ATM, in a sense, you're right. It's like, this is so much more convenient, but then it's like, no, you're doing another job here. You're now the teller.
Yeah. It's like, what labor are people willing? It's a trade, right? I mean, it's a political economy, right? Like what labor are they willing to trade for what conveniences? And some people will happily check out their own groceries for the convenience of not having to talk to another human being. So like, I'm sure.
Exactly.
Yeah.
I could call a pizza place, let alone do something like that. So.
Right. Yeah.
I like that. Like when I mean, sort of extrapolating from the idea of the Turker, right? When do people notice they're a Turker and when they're not? So,
we're all Turkers.
Bagging my own groceries.
Yeah.
I like bagging my own groceries, but that's because I have really relationships with the various cashiers at the Schnucks I go to. So
I miss my cashiers. Oh my God. Yeah.
See, it's inefficient because I do it because I'm like slow at it, but I do it so I can chat, and like people get really mad at me if they're behind me in line. I'm like, this is not a time to chat with Gloria. I'm like, I know, but I haven't talked to her in a month and I need to check in. Okay.
Nathaniel, literally nothing you could have told me would have surprised me less.
Yeah, it's it takes me forever to grocery shop because
Mm-hmm.
yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a walking inefficiency. Okay, well then that I think nicely, not me being a walking inefficiency, nicely transitions us. So I feel like we got into the ant stuff a little bit there. So I'm gonna jump ahead to our next talking point. And you also added some around this. So that one of our questions for you is sort of thinking about how we're engaging the subjects in this research, and particularly thinking about the kinds of prepositions that go along with that, like work, for or with or along, right? So I guess sort of how you approach sort of, or you're thinking about sort of how one engages participants in research and how that's itself a kind of function of the network, right? How one is able to engage participants, how one would want to engage them, and then thinking about kinds of not compromises, but sort of research setups that allow you to engage them, effectively, but also ethically with their own, the work that they'd be doing within your study.
Yeah. I mean, I think that contrast that you just made between effective and ethical is a really important one. Like, so often in research, human subjects research, the question is about effective for the researcher, right? And the ethics piece is hoop jumping. And I don't mean that to be critical of folks who approach human subjects research that way, right? Like if they're meeting the bar and jumping through the hoop, then that's great, right? Like I don't think that's necessarily bad. I think, for example, I had this conversation with somebody at the IRB here in the IRB office here at UK. So it was someone like Amy, I think it was, that you all talked with.
Amy Evans.
Yeah. And she's at Wilmington, right, Jeremy? Yeah. So I have a relationship with folks in the IRB office here at this point. So I have like two guys that I can call on the phone and be like, hey, I'm thinking about this issue and what's going on. And I remember one time I was supervising a student project, and the student was struggling with getting a certain recruitment mechanism through IRB. And so I called, I think that time there's Dan and there's Craig, and they're both great. And so I called Dan, and I was on the phone in the lobby of the office building. So this was in the before times, right? Before Corona. And, I asked him the question. I was in the lobby because I didn't want to get on the elevator and lose the call. And so he answered, we sort of talked it through. I was like, oh, that's great. Thank you so much. And he was like, yeah, I mean, anytime, just call me. Like, we love it when you faculty, you researchers, work with us ahead of time instead of like toiling away in obscurity, sending in an IRB out of the blue, a protocol, and then being surprised when there's an issue. And I said, why? I mean, does everybody not do this? Like, I feel like you all are such a great resource and you see so many projects and I have so much to learn from you. And he was like, oh, no. Most people do not see us as a resource. That is unusual. And I find that so sad, I guess. So in terms of engaging participants, I think it's such a big topic. It's one of these things where it's like, I have three things I want to say, but I have to say them all at the same time because they all affect each other. So I guess the first thing I'll say is about my training, my methodological training. So like many rhetoricians, my methodological training is not primarily in human subjects research. And I think that's something you all are running up against, right? Where I know, Jeremy, you've done human subjects research before, right?
I have. We did interviews, essentially, yes.
Okay. Yeah. So fairly straightforward in terms of methodology. Right. Yeah.
Yes. And, not super high stakes in terms of vulnerability.
Right. Nathaniel, have you?
Most of my IRB stuff has been exempted because it's basically working with students in my class. So I forget what the phrase we use here, but like if it's just part of the natural occurrence of your classroom, as long as post tests. So they were,
hmm Yeah. And so I think that's where a lot of for a lot of traditional like rec comp grad training programs, pedagogical research is the place where you see attention to human subjects research most commonly. And then secondarily in tech comm. So in tech comm, it's sort of much more common, right, to do ethnographic. I think of like my colleague here, Brian McNeely, who's done a lot of great ethnographic work, interviews, surveys, like really borrowing heavily from social sciences, but also from, I think of them as like the sister disciplines, anthropology and sociology, right? Where they're like us, kind of straddle the humanistic social science divide, and are ambivalent about quantitative methods. So I didn't get a lot of training in human subjects research. I definitely read human subjects research, right? So I read publications. And Meredith Johnson, formerly Zodaway, was my advisor in grad school. And she has done human subjects research. So that was definitely something I talked with her about. But it wasn't, I never got a class on it. Like I never got trained to write an IRB protocol. Like a lot of this was sort of figuring it out as I went. And so what ended up happening in a potentially useful way, I think, is that I always started from theory and then back-ended into methods, right? Like it wasn't, I'm a political scientist and I do surveys and this is how you do surveys. And then, oh, by the way, there are people who theorize survey research, right? It's always been the other way around for me. So that's the first thing I was going to say. The second thing was related to the grad school training. I did take a course in the communications department at University of South Florida, where I did my PhD. And it was a participatory action research course. So that's the one like dedicated methods class I took in grad school that wasn't sort of a methods survey. And it was incredible. So we didn't do an IRB, like it was none of it was intended for publication. So we were able to just sort of focus on the work. But the thing with participatory action research, so for folks who aren't familiar, it's primarily comes out of Latin American and South American organizing. So Paulo Freire is a name that you hear associated a lot with participatory action research. And it's exactly what it sounds like, right? So it's research that is participatory in the sense that you have not research subjects, but participants. And you yourself as a researcher are a participant, right? So the idea is to do away with the sort of hierarchy of like, I am the expert and you are the subject and I'm treating you like a lab rat. And then the action piece is that the research is supposed to be action oriented, right? So there's supposed to be some kind of outcome that actually serves the participants' own goals. Mm-hmm. And the own goals piece is incredibly important there. So part of what distinguishes participatory action research, and to an extent, a kind of related thread of what's called community-based participatory research, or CBPR, because God, we love our acronyms, don't we? So you have PAR, P-A-R, participatory action research, and CBPR, community-based participatory research, which you see that invoked a lot in public health is a space where you see it. Also ag, like ag economics, community development, anyone who's doing sort of translational work with ag extension agents, you'll see that over there. So that thread is similar, but doesn't have that same sort of like radical strain of theory to it. It can, but it doesn't necessarily. PAR sort of, at least in its traditional purist form, is radical, right? It's anti-capitalist, it's anti-hierarchy, it's anti not anti-expertise, but anti-dichotomizing expertise. And so having that exposure in this grad class was like life-changing, literally. I mean, it just blew my mind wide open in terms of thinking about knowledge-making practices. So I'd been reading, theories of expertise in rhetoric of science. So like Collins and Evans and third wave of expertise, and having that sort of like really grounded introduction to what it looks like to actually take those theories seriously and translate them into practice was, it just gave me a whole new perspective on what I'm doing. Like, what am I doing with my life as a researcher, right? So that's the second thing I was going to say, is like the role that exposure to theories around like participatory action research and community-based participatory research is so important. And this goes back to what you said, Nathaniel, about the effective versus ethical. I think when we think about human subjects research, it's very easy for folks who don't have training already to get that little tickle of imposter syndrome and go, oh, I need to bone up on theory, or not theory, sorry, on methods, right? I need to I gotta study statistics, and I gotta do this, and I gotta do that. And it's like, I mean, sure, yes, you need to know the method, but the theory piece is just as, if not more important, understanding why you're talking to humans and what your relationship with those humans is as a researcher is just as fundamental as understanding, how to develop a randomized sample. So then the third thing, I said I had three things. That was the first two, is rec comp training, exposure to radical participatory action research, and slightly less radical, but still kind of community-based. So the third thing I was going to say is about your question about prepositions. So Nathaniel sent me this Google Doc with the questions. And so the question specifically says, think through the prepositions we use when discussing this being engaging subjects in research. So preposition examples are with, from, along, and for, right? Are we doing research with participants, from participants, along with participants, for participants? And you could add, other prepositions to that list for sure. Mm-hmm. And I think that there's a sort of weak form of engagement or participatory research where you do all the things you would have done anyway, but you just call the people you're doing it with participants instead of subjects, right? That's the sort of oh no. I guess that's the fake woke version of participatory research, is just don't call them subjects.
It's
what?
I'm just imagining for some reason I did I was now Marie Antoinette going, you're all my participants.
Yes, no, exactly. And then if you're feeling generous, let my participants eat cake, right?
Of course.
Yeah.
There's going to be,
of course. Yeah. But I think to get to a strong form, what's really important is understanding two things: understanding why you're doing what you're doing, right? Really not just in some sort of scholarly, I'm interested in this question, but deep-seated, what are my motivations here, right? Why am I pursuing this question? And two, what is the relationship that I'm developing with the people who I'm relying on to help me pursue this question? So, I think that, so if we take a pretty straightforward example of human subjects research that's considered pretty would be exempt, which of course in IRB parlance doesn't mean exempt from IRB review. People get confused about this all the time, right? It doesn't mean oh, that's not, it just means it's exempt from full board review. So it's low risk enough. You all know this, I'm speaking for the record. Exempt from full board review. So it's low risk, and probably you're not collecting identifying information on your participants, and you're not asking them questions or asking them to do anything that would put them in a high risk or especially vulnerable situation. And you're not working with any vulnerable populations, which are children, incarcerated people, and mentally disabled people. It used to be pregnant people, but they changed that last year. Yeah, they dropped pregnant people from the federal registry or federal statute, whatever, because there was a huge problem, right, where medical research was simply not doing any research with pregnant people. And so that's how you end up in a situation where pregnant people are I literally don't know if I could take a Tylenol, not because we know it's bad, but because we don't know if it's okay, because researchers just don't do research. So at any rate, So an example of like a super straightforward exam study would be a large scale national poll, asking people about like voting preferences, for example, where you've got a polling firm that you contract out with. So I'm a researcher. I have $10,000. I spend it to pay a firm that does this. So Qualtrics, actually, the survey platform, has a wing that will do this, right? You can pay them and they'll do subject recruitment for you. And, they whip up a demographically representative sample, make phone calls or send, letters in the mail, like however your methods are, and you get them back, right? So that's human subjects research, but you're potentially, relying on thousands and thousands of people to answer your question. So let's say it's a poll. Like a national political poll, you might have like 5,000 participants, right? Or 5,000 subjects who respond to your survey. And your relationship with them is practically nil, right? Like you don't talk to them one-on-one. You have, by design, you don't know who they are, right? And so the relationship piece of that is you're not engaging them, right, as a person. You're treating them as a source of data. And that's fine. Like, I'm not saying that's bad, but I think it's just important. Again, like I said, the two questions are, why are you doing this? And what is your relationship with participants? And so being very clear, like, for me, in this study, these people are a source of data, and that's it, right? Like, nothing I do is going to help them. Nothing I do is about providing care for them. Nothing I do is, right? Now, you can change that a little. So I think, for example, of a survey that I ran in collaboration with the Arboretum here, it's the state Arboretum, State Botanical Garden of Kentucky, and I'm working with them on their interpretive planning process. So they're trying to develop an interpretive plan that will guide all interpretation or translation, right, of horticultural information around the garden for the next umpteen years. And as part of that, they wanted to do visitor research, which in rhetorical terms, they wanted audience analysis. And I was like, pick me, I can do that for you. So we designed this survey, and there was actually, you might have seen it. It was on Facebook back when I was on Facebook. I sort of crowdsourced feedback on ethnic and racial categories for our demographics. And there was a conversation I had as a result of that, actually primarily with Scott Graham. He and I talked at length about this question of, is race and ethnicity an independent or a dependent variable, right? So is it something that you want to use as a point of comparison, or is it something that you want to discover? And those are two different things. And so if you want to be able to take your survey results and compare them to survey results from other surveys, then you have to use the same race ethnicity categories, right? And that makes that an independent variable, or no, dependent. Now I'm getting myself mixed up. But if part of what you're interested in is discovering how people identify vis-a-vis race and ethnicity, then, use whatever categories you like, let people write it in, right? So the kinds of data that we're trying to collect and the kinds of things that we want to do with that data might drive us to ask the same question, but in different ways. And the different ways that we ask that question might change our relationship to participants. So I ended up going with, you know what, I'm going to give a really broad set of categories. I'm not using census categories. I crowdsourced help on that. I did a bunch of research on like ways to create really inclusive race ethnicity questions. Spoiler, like, always make sure it's check all that apply, always provide, an other option. Try to avoid monoliths, right? So don't use Asian, use like Southeast Asian, East Asian, right? Provide multiple, like, not just Native American, right? But we've got First Nations, we've got Native American, we've got, yeah. So on that survey, I had multiple people in the last question, we had a sort of like, is there anything else you want to tell us? I had multiple people say, thank you. Thank you for giving me the options, right? Both on that and then on gender, we provided a non-binary and an other. Now, to be fair, I also got one response where a respondent wrote as the other. So the options were, man, woman, non-binary, other, and someone selected other so they could write in the box, what is this ridiculous, like, progressive nonsense? I'm ashamed to be a UK alum. And I was like, you just gave me an other data point. Like, what are you doing? I mean, obviously I threw that out, but like that data point,
I mean, the
right?
potential, I thought that conversation was going to go a different direction, where it was being labeled an other, right? As its own kind of stakes, right?
Oh, for sure.
Yeah.
And in fact, this is a thing I went back and forth on, was, do you just provide a blank spot,
right,
and allow people to, and trust people to know what that means, right? And I ended up going with the other and then the blank as a sort of standard survey. I'm still not convinced that was the right call, for exactly the reason that you suggest, Jeremy, right? Like, that it changes the stakes, and to be like, oh, other. Yeah. So even within the confines of a survey where I don't know who these people are, right? I have no identifying information. I never have direct interaction with them. I can still decide what kind of relationship I want to establish to them through my ethos, which I create through the way that I design the questions and the way that I design the instructions, right? So even in the like most straightforwardly non-engaged, right? Like, I'm not actually interacting with these people. They are just a data source. I can still make choices that shift my relationship to them in various ways. And then the question of like, why am I doing this? I think is really important, because that also allows us to think differently about our relationships with people. So on the other end of the spectrum, I have a project that I'm working on with the Kentucky Geological Survey, where we're actually just wrapping up interviews. We've been working with people in Eastern Kentucky to find out about them. It's an incredibly open-ended, it's mixed methods, but it's all qualitative methods. And essentially what we want to do is find out like who's out there and how can KGS serve them, the Geological Survey. And the way that we are going about it, because originally Bill, who's the state geologist who I have been working with in various capacities for the last few years, came to me and said, I want to reach new stakeholders. Can you help me do that? And I was like, yes, that sounds great. And I said, who are the stakeholders that you want to reach, the new ones? And he said, I don't know. And I said, well, what do they need from you? And he said, I don't know. And I said, let's start there. So we're just going to go out and like ask people what their problems are, what their needs are, what their desires are. And then based on our knowledge of KGS, try and make some of those connections. And so these are folks, we have 12 participants. I have spent so much time on the phone with these people. I have spent, we've exchanged so many emails. We did photo voice where they send us photographs. So I've got like these wonderful personal photographs of some of the highest highs and lowest lows. I have photographs of people celebrating a win when they were able to get a citizens grassroots group together to change something in their community. And I also have photos of someone's house that was completely destroyed by a tornado, right? Like, I know these people intimately and they know me, and we've developed this trust relationship. And that's a space where if the goal of this project was just for me to publish academic work, I don't think I could do it. I think that I would feel incredibly exploitative. The goal of this project, the number one thing that we're doing, is trying to find ways for this state agency, KGS, which is also a part of the University of Kentucky. It's a weird, but it's also like legislatively mandated, like they have to exist, which is nice because that means they like get funding. So we have money to do things. But that's the primary goal, right? Is finding ways for this state agency to serve these populations. So we're making things for them. Like the end product of this collaboration is we're making stuff that these people can actually use in their everyday lives.
Yeah.
And then we're going to publish academic work. And so that's a space where I think of, my motivation for doing this is intimately tied to my relationship with participants. And I also think it makes me more effective, right? Like we've built a trust relationship, you know, and I intend to maintain those relationships. You hear about this with like anthropologists in particular who do a lot of ethnographic work, this question of like, you know, what happens when you wrap your scholarship in a community and then you don't. There's a great piece, and I'm blanking on who wrote it, where it's a quote from a research participant is the title, and it's, are you going to stop coming to visit? Right. And so I already have plans because we were supposed to go out there and do all this stuff in person, but then COVID. So we have plans, like our research team is invited to come and like spend the night with people, and they're going to take us out hiking, and they want to show us like all of these places they're so proud of. And I'm going to do it. I'm really looking forward to it, you know? Yeah. So anyway, that's the thing about research participants, I think, is like, it's not that it's bad to not, you don't have to, every research project doesn't have to be that, you know, like we need those large scale survey based, et cetera, but just being really clear, because I think it's very easy for us to lie to ourselves about why we're doing what we're doing.
Yeah, that's an excellent transition point, because that's Nathaniel and I've been kind of grappling with this because, you know, initially we were kind of thinking, well, the next piece here then is finding out things like impact on Turkers. But then the more we were dealing with that, you know, and that would be, you know, probably along the lines of like ethnography. And the more we were dealing with that, we were like, so what do we do? Just like ask them. So, you know, those kind of questions like, you know, how does this impact you? What's your life? You know, but then we were sort of more like, but that's not really our thing. You know, so, you know, one thing is, as you say, imposter syndrome. I'm not a social scientist, you know. Mm-hmm. And some of that work has been done both in scholarship and journalism in different ways, right? Where it's, you know, demographics and economic impact. And so it's like, so what would we be doing? And so we were shading further away from that and more into questions of, because we're rhetoricians, you know, it's like, well, what about the language itself of the hits and how and now I'm quailing at saying that, but how authors and how Turkers engage with that language, and how we measure that as like, well, different responses. And so we're shading more and more towards things like, well, if you write things in this way, what happens versus if you write things in that way. And so we're getting more and more away from, as you point out, this kind of participation and increasingly drawing towards, you know, them as data points. I mean, which
again, it sounds like I'm critiquing, and I'm not. I think I'm critiquing the impulse to elide the fact that those are different things, not critiquing the fact that they're different things.
But it is making, I mean, even what you said is making me conscious about saying things like participants, because in a sense, we're participating in the platform, but we're not participating in the research.
Yes.
In the same ways. And we're not even participating in the Turk in the same ways, right? I mean, you're right. There's potentially some valence there of saying, well, you know, well, we're participating in the platform, but there's the very real stakes of some of those participants having vulnerabilities and dependencies that, you know, potentially we're just kind of stomping right through, you know? And we've done that from other sources that are saying, you know, you may be kind of coarsely handling some things that you're not aware of.
I mean, maybe. I was just about to say, based on my reading and watching so far, I think that you all are thinking about this more than is often the case. It's extremely distressing to me how much research, you know, I like that phrase of stomping, like, or that idea, metaphor, like, there's a lot of research that just stomps around, and it's very distressing. And so I think the fact that you're asking these questions is really important. And I think about like, so you had the idea, I don't know if you're still going to pursue this, and it sounds like maybe you are from what you just said, Jeremy, of the sort of A/B testing of hit language, right? And so that can absolutely be done ethically if, as you say, you're aware of like, what are the stakes for people, and what can we do to make sure that this experiment, because that is experimental, right? That this experiment does not, well, in IRB parlance, it's harm, right? Like, they're concerned with harm. That's the primary thing. And I know you've talked about this a fair bit, that it's like risk mitigation. And if someone isn't at risk, then they're not really legible to the IRB as a human. Yeah, which is so interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, which is really different. So the IRB system is US centric, right? Like that's not how it works across the board everywhere, which is one of the reasons it's hard to do international work. There are established mechanisms for doing international work in like biomedicine, for example. Not that it's easy, but for folks like us who are just sort of tiptoeing into the human subjects research realm, it's much harder. But I, for example, think of the Association of Internet Researchers ethics platform. So they have guidelines for doing internet research, and they talk about ethical plurality, right? So the US system, the IRB system, is utilitarian. It's weighing risk versus weighing benefit. And, you can do research that provides no direct benefit to your participants if there's also minimal risk, right? And so that's one way that you could assess like an A/B thing, where your participants are not better off from having, picked one of your tasks. However, they also are not harmed if both tasks pay the same, if you make sure that they're both available the same number of times. You would want to make sure that you're probably what I would do is make sure to put them up simultaneously every time. Okay. So that you make sure that you're not disadvantaging people who are on the platform in a certain time zone, for example, right? So you would want to make sure that everything is as identical as possible, like everything except for exactly the thing. Plus that's just better science, right? Because it's like you can really isolate that variable of the language if you're doing it all, but down to the last T crossed and I dotted, right? That's one way to do it. But then if you think about methodological plurality, right? If you think about it not just as a sort of utilitarian risk benefit calculation, but for example, one ethical framework that you might approach this from is a feminist ethic of care, which is something that the Association of Internet Researchers talks about. And actually I talk about in the piece I have coming out in Computers and Composition. So what would it mean to care for and care about the people on the other end of this task? Mm-hmm. And I don't know for sure. One thing it might mean is offering a higher rate than usual to offset the care that they're not receiving from unscrupulous requesters from the Amazon platform itself. But you have to weigh that against the fact that might skew the results.
Yeah, that's something that's because we found some guidelines that are specifically for using MTurk for research. And I
read those from the Turkopticon.
Yeah, and it dips into fair compensation. And one of the variables we were looking at is differences in compensation. And it makes this so weird because it's like, as you say, if we post them simultaneously and one of them's higher compensated and everything's identical, that in itself is a weirdness, because it's like, well, then it's not really simultaneously, because the impetus is clearly, it's like, well, I'm going to do the higher paid one,
Yeah. And this also feeds into your questions about like the algorithmic role of the system, the platform, right? Because those things are going to get sorted differently.
Yeah.
Whereas if you put I don't know for sure, but I would assume that if you put the exact same task with slightly different language, but the same compensation level and the same, and like posted at exactly the same time, that those would appear like in the list of hits, like next to each other, right? Yeah. Whereas if the compensation level is different, then they'll get sorted differently, or Turkers can sort them differently.
Yes,
because I think Turkers then have their own mechanisms whereby they can sort the hits themselves.
Exactly.
Party systems and
So let me ask you all a question then.
Yes.
I just made the conflation of care equals money. What are other ways that you can demonstrate care that isn't financial compensation?
Question.
This is a great final question. is also what there's additionally the conflation of pay versus duration of the hit. So that how much you pay per hit. So in many ways, right, I think care could also be thought through in terms of time, how much you're compensating them, but that compensation is always also thought in terms of the level of time they'll need to complete the task. So it's being cognizant both of the level of compensation, but also the kind of level of investment. And I think thinking of, I mean, going back to that example of, right, that Amazon paid me 50 cents to relive my most traumatic moment, is potentially, as we're thinking about the sort of hypothetical hits we're generating, hits, asking of them, right? So do we generate hits that avoid kinds of things, right? And just do, I mean, because we're also thinking about when we talk with Sean Zednick later in the month.
Ooh,
right?
You're talking to Sean, yay. Okay.
In which, like, because we're interested in readability is our general thing. So thinking about the readability of alt tags or captions, and then giving Turkers a list and pick which ones you think are the most readable, right? I don't know what kinds of images would we use, right? So like, I care in the sense of how long a task takes, right? How much of their time are we asking for? But so what's the nature of the hit, right? So we're not asking them to relive something traumatic. I mean, I don't think we would do that, but that's a way we could think through.
Being conscious about.
I mean,
go
ahead, Jeremy.
I was just going to, and even in the language itself, I mean, we might want to think through things like acknowledging that a person is doing this.
Yes.
Providing thank yous, and, and we've aimed to keep this brief because we respect your time, and we know we'd have to think about this, but I mean, in terms of, we're cognizant of the fact that if you're doing this, your goal is to get through it as fast as you can because you got to do another one, right? These things stack. It's not like you're getting a paid flat rate here. So consciousness, and even, putting in the language itself, acknowledgement that you're a human in certain ways, and thanking you, and those kinds of things.
Yeah.
Acknowledging that there is a relationship there, right? Which is so often not the case. Two last thoughts on that.
Yes.
One is one of my, I don't know if this is a thing I'm ever going to do anything about, because I don't know what to do about it. But one of the great ironies, I think, of the IRB system is that one of the three principles from the Belmont report that drive IRB ethics is respect for persons, right? So the idea that people should be able to, this is where informed consent comes from, right? You should respect persons as individuals with agency who should be able to make decisions for themselves, given, a full set of information about risks and benefits. What that has translated into is a set of unreadable documents, like the informed consent form and the IRB. I mean, again, like most IRBs that I've worked with, they talk about, like, make sure that you're writing things in ways that are understandable to participants, et cetera, et cetera. But if I tried to turn in like an infographic looking informed consent form, they would be like, no, even if that's more readable. So their idea of readability in relation to respect for persons is extremely textually oriented, right? And what we know from like tech comm research is the actual words are just one small piece of the puzzle in terms of like usability, readability. And so anyway, so that's one side note. The second thing I was going to say, and this is much more relevant to what you're doing right now, is why do you have to have them actually do a task? Like, what if they select the task? And I know you talked with Amy about, like, there's a deception piece involved. Deception, not a bad thing, right? That's a technical term from IRB land about, are you selectively omitting information in order to test a phenomenon without the participant's awareness of the phenomenon affecting the phenomenon? It comes from psych, right? Primarily. But if you're doing A/B testing, then you need to engage in a little bit of selective omission. Like, what if you wrote the language creatively so that once they click through, it was like, thank you so much. Here's what we were doing. Like, you just jump straight to the debrief. Here's what we were doing by choosing this, you've already done work for us, the work that we needed you to do. Here are some links to resources for Turkers. Have a great day. Like, why do you need to have them do more labor? Like, you don't care about CAPTCHAs.
Yeah, I mean, of course, that was a question we had that goes back to the motive question. Like, what do we actually, because there was when we got it right of these hits, but like, yeah, but we don't actually care about generating image.
Why not just give them money? They already did the work that you wanted to do by clicking on the hit. Give them money for doing that.
Fascinating.
Yeah.
Right. And this goes back to the, like, what is your purpose here? And that can drive your relationship. So if your relationship with this participant is that you've already established several parameters, right? You want your relationship to be one of person to person, human to human, right? Where you want them to know that they're a human. You want them to know that you respect their time. You articulated that as well. And you want them to know that you value their labor and their, like, expertise as a person who is in this positionality and doing this labor. And the moment that they click on one of your ABs, they've done all those things, right? Like they have done the labor that you want. So if you respect their time and you value the labor that they're giving you, then they don't have to do anything else for you.
Yeah.
Right. Or even if you do decide, right, like, we do have a task that we want them to do, making sure that it's relevant to the project as opposed to busy work. And articulating to them how it's relevant to the project.
Yeah. All right. Well, this was a jam-packed hour.
Yeah.
Well, I can't leave without saying also Amazon sucks and none of us should be using Amazon services. But anyway, that's my hobby horse.
About, like, where we want to know about the platform. So we have to engage. So that's right. Always just that also is in the back of our minds too, is we want to get a sense of how the system is working. And, but, in an Antish kind of way, we're following the actors, right? So, yeah.
And in order to do that, you literally have to give money to Amazon because they take, what's it up to? Like 30 to 50% of the hit payment.
Yeah. Because when you do the request, there's a tax basically on top there.
Yeah. So you are paying this behemoth platform in order to understand this behemoth platform. And it's a platform that's part of a company whose, largest stakeholder, Jeff Bezos, is anti-public education. Like, that's a weird situation that you find yourself in. And I don't have any answers for you, but I think I would be remiss if I didn't mention that in a conversation about ethics.
No, I think that's, yeah. So I think every time we do a hit, I'm going to go buy something from a local bookstore. Does that it'll make,
I mean, sure. Right. Like, there's like an offset piece, or
it's like a carbon offset. I'm going to buy some
a local shopping offset. Yeah. Or even thinking about, like, what is the end goal? Like, what are you doing with your findings? Right. And I'm not saying you have to become like anti-capitalist activists and post up outside Amazon's headquarters, but what is there a motivation besides scratching a scholarly itch that you can, even if that's where things started, right?
Yeah.
Is there a motivation that you can tap into that allows you to juggle the ethical imperative to, not contribute to, like, anti-public education, not contribute to worker exploitation? And again, lots of us academics hand wave it away by going, it's the knowledge, we need to know. And once we know, we're rhetoricians. We know better than anybody. Just because people know shit doesn't mean anything changes.
Right.
Yeah. So, like,
look at
that is not sufficient. It is not sufficient for you to say, well, we're investigating this platform and it's important for people to know. It is sufficient if you decide you don't care about that ethical question. But if you do, okay, I'm done grandstanding.
That's a lot. You've given us a lot of fascinating, things to conceptualize. I really appreciate also that this is kairotic, that you're here now, because, we're in the stage of doing things like, figuring out what kind of hits are we posting? What are we doing with it? Right.
Yeah.
I think this is super timely.
Yeah. I love what you're doing here. I think the project is, again, I don't think saying like this is important is sufficient in terms of like really addressing all the thorny ethical issues, but that doesn't change the fact that this is important. And I'm really glad you're doing this work. And also I'm glad you're doing it in this cool way. Like, this is so awesome. I was doing laundry, like listening to Scott Graham on double speed, be like, computational rhetoric. So it was like, really, I mean, this is great.
And his voice is much more soothing at double speed, weirdly.
Oh my God. It's, yeah. When I like accidentally toggled the setting back and it was at normal speed and I was like, you all are so slow. Yeah. Well, thank you for having me. This has been a delight.
No, thank you so much. It's been super helpful. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I think Biden is now up in Pennsylvania. So
and at Georgia. Yeah.
I was gonna say I woke up to the Georgia news and now Pennsylvania. Yeah. Yeah. Also, I miss having these conversations. Like, conferences are the space where the number of times we've like sat around at 10 p.m. having a conversation about unsolvable problems.
We were glad
recording.
Yeah, I'm glad. Well, I'm glad that some of those weren't recorded, but glad that this one is. But yeah, no,
that's fair.
Infrastructure in place. So yeah, okay. Well, I think we're gonna call it an episode, and then we will. This was live streaming, but we'll also post it in the archive on the site, and then we'll announce it once it's up too, because it is also Friday at 8:00 Central Time. So that does the network did not give us a primetime slot for our show, so we're always competing for ad and stuff. So
of course. Did you decide what to call your interlocutors in these videos?
Not yet.
Not yet. Let me know when you do, and I'll put it on my CV.
Participants.
Yeah, I mean, well, I think it's like, let me see, I can look at it right here. It says, I think contributors, or I think it says video discussion contributors. Yeah, video discussion contributors. That's what it says.
I don't know. I'm actually thinking now subjects.
I mean, kind of. Just be careful, because then IRB is going to be on your ass.
That's true. Yeah.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
Well.
All right. Well, thank you guys.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
Bye.